Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about how a state gets its power. Where does a state actually get its absolute power within its own borders? It's sovereignty. And we're going to be looking at four different origins of how a country becomes a country. Four different political theories. We're now getting into political philosophy, and this is going to kind of evolve us towards the United States government. So we have government, and the government is an institution that makes and enforces law. We have, of course, our three branches: the president, the judicial branch, the courts, and of course, the Congress, and the Speaker of House of Representatives, Mike Johnson. Remember that all governments have the power to make law, enforce law, and interpret law. This is your legislative, executive, and judicial powers. We're going to be diving more into this as we go along. And remember that every government has the ability to rule, the right to rule, the people's belief in the ability or the right for a government to rule, and supreme power and authority within their own borders. And remember that there are four parts to any state. They got to have people, they got to have defined borders, they got to have government, and that last one right there, the one we're focusing on today, and that is sovereignty. All right. How is it that these countries, how does a state actually gain its sovereignty? What's the difference between a group of people that have all these, they have government or have defined borders, but what makes a group of people actually become a state, a country? And that's what we're looking at right now with this section. So there are four theories that political scientists go to in terms of how does a state actually come to power. Number one of which is by force. Basically, there's an individual or a group that is the strongest and they have the power and they basically just rule over a population and say, guess what? you know, I'm the state now. I'm the country now. I rule in it all, and I rule it by force. And force allows me to keep other countries out and makes me have control within, whether it's weapons, fear, oppression, respect. It could be any number of things. But the force theory is that look, the strongest have power and eventually created a country when they ruled over the people. Now, a political philosopher that followed this that we're going to look at is Niccolo Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote a famous book called The Prince from Venice. And in the book is about referencing to a king. To be a good king, there are these things that you need to have. But the thing is, back when he wrote this a long time ago, hundreds of years ago, he was really brutal. He was like, if you have to, sometimes, it's great to be loved and respected as a leader, but sometimes, realistically, you need to kill people. If it means wiping out entire families that might stand out against you, you got to do it. And his famous quote out of The Prince is, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." And so, as like a political theory, Niccolo Machiavelli was really big into the idea that power and force is what allows you to become a state, a country. Okay. So number one is force theory. Number two, oh, by the way, force theory has happened throughout history, whether it's Russia trying to force its way into Ukraine to conduct its sovereignty, whether it's manifest destiny against any indigenous tribes anywhere in the world, when you have an imperial power that's simply stronger, takes them over, or when you want to talk about like medieval Europe, kings and monarchs from a long time ago, that that's an example of force theory in action. Number two is the divine right theory, that God actually made a state and that sovereignty came from those that are actually chosen by God, and that God has the power to create and eliminate a state. It's pretty simple. Divine right meaning right of God. And you see this throughout history and recent times too, whether you have the old kings, you have the old dynasties from China. The Aztec Empire, of course, also was an issue of divinity, and currently, like the Catholic Church with the Pope, or in Iran with Islamic law, that Allah is closer to the supreme leader than to any other citizens, essentially. So God has allowed him to help rule this country. So the divine right of kings, is basically the idea that God has chosen you to run the country, and therefore you get to run the country, because that's kind of how it works with divine right. Theory number three is what's called the evolution theory, that countries just naturally formed through a process of evolution. You have this family, and eventually these families come together and they create a clan, and those clans come together and create a tribe. And eventually those tribes, they used to move from place to place to place. Almost every tribe, if you go far enough back, was some kind of nomadic tribe. They would travel around to where the resources, the factors of production, the labor, the land, the capital actually were. And eventually, those nations of people settle down. They have borders that are set up, even though they're just like not really like specific political borders. But eventually, um, those nations settle down and naturally become a state. They get enough power and influence to keep out others. The people within actually believe that those people have the right to rule. And over time, you go from families to clans to tribes to nations, and eventually, as people settle down, create governments, borders, you naturally come into the power of a state. And we see this to some aspect when you go back to indigenous tribes over time, started as individuals and then families. And remember that Native American um, states did exist. I mean, they had everything that's there. There were borders, sovereignty. There was, people in government, and it doesn't matter that it might have seemed now as not very complex. It wasn't complex for that time, and it did naturally eventually create state-like organizations. Don't say that the Aztec Empire did not have defined borders, government, um, people, and sovereignty, because it clearly did. Okay, so over time, you did have the evolution of people going from very small groups to one very big group that eventually creates the state. The final one, and this is the one that we're really going to focus on, is the concept of the social contract theory, that states form when people agree to give up some freedom in exchange for security. So people are like, all right, I'll give up some of my liberty in exchange that I trust that you're going to protect me. Okay. And the social contract theory is the most complex, and it also is the most relevant to the United States in terms of political theories. And there's some people that we're going to talk about as we go forward in class are that really promoted the social contract theory. And of course, the social contract theory is the primary method that the United States was created. The idea that most people in the US give up some sense of uh, freedom in exchange for safety, security of the government. Now, the three philosophers that really promoted this idea were one, Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes agreed, now, a long time ago, Thomas Hobbes said, look, people cannot just be free to kind of naturally act like what they want to act, because people are violent, people are chaotic, they're going to kill each other unless they have a ruler. Now, his belief was you needed somebody called a sovereign, which was essentially a king that had absolute power, and that king should have a contract with the people that he is not going to be abusive, and and he's going to be good to his people, because the people will see him as somebody that's protecting them, and they will give up that idea that they will be ruled by this person, because if you don't have a ruler, you're just going to have chaos. um, Now, obviously, his idea that it should be a king wasn't, at the time, it was popular, but it was really unusual that it was like people should give up some power to a king and the king should be good to its people, but you do need some kind of ruler. All right. Eventually, Hobbes's theory starts to evolve to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who says, yeah, but your social contract is right, but people need to have a social contract with each other. Kind of the idea that people must actually be free to rule themselves. And Rousseau really believed in the concept of a direct democracy, where the people should should be the ultimate power within themselves. That you shouldn't have, a political hierarchical structure where you have, people that are elected to positions of power or anything like that, because then eventually those people will end up wanting all power and creating the state all for themselves. And eventually, even Rousseau's idea, like, people were, these two ideas almost kind of conflict, even though both have the idea that people give up some power, in this case to the king for protection, in this case to the group for protection. Eventually, all of this evolves into John Locke. And John Locke is basically people are born with the right to life, liberty, and property, and that a ruler, people will give up some of their freedom to make sure that a ruler protects their life, liberty, and property. But if the ruler abuses people's life, liberty, and property, then the people have the right to remove that ruler from power and put somebody in that is going to help protect life, liberty, and property. That's the social contract. The social contract is I trust you to protect me and my life and my liberty and my property. And I'm going to allow you to stay into power if you keep doing that. You don't do that, I'm going to remove you. And John Locke's idea was eventually becomes the basis for the Declaration of Independence. And so that's a huge part of who we are as Americans, the idea of the social contract. I give up some freedom, you get to remain in power. So the four methods at which we create a country: force, the strongest, build that sovereignty; divine right, God helps build that sovereignty; evolution, nature over time goes from families to clans to tribes to nations to states, eventually developing evolution wise that sovereignty; and finally, social contract. People are willing to give up some freedom to some kind of government in exchange for protection. Therefore, they are granted that sovereignty.